Hey, Bob.
How we doing?
This
fan.
Okay.
I know, you must be feeling to sit on that side of the room.
Well, you just have
Yeah, and
such a
I've not
little
sit on
view.
this side for a long time.
I know, it's like I don't,
I could do it this way too.
and as always, we're really glad for those who are joining us live stream. That's always wonderful.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
We're waiting.
So just a couple announcements before we jump into First Timothy. Happy hour has really gone quite well. So I hope that if you haven't joined us, Zinfandel is next Monday. That's the main thing, to have the right wine. It's not. Okay. But what we're finding that certain people are very knowledgeable about wine. Good gracious.
How did that happen?
Very intimidating.
It is intimidating a little bit. And, you know, Dennis and Carla do a marvelous job, but we're finding out Gary Strauss in particular
Oh, yeah.
is a real aficionado. Just, I mean, has studied this a long time, knows a lot, you know, so I think even Dennis is a little intimidated. We all
That
are.
takes
So,
something.
and I think we're on the season 1, episode 6 coming up. I think that's right, but be paying attention. I think it's some of the best Bible study we do. I just love the discussions, and people are always picking up different innuendos, again, because it's visual. And I think that's what we found out here. The visual part of this helps. Some of us are better if we have a text in front of us and can go back to certain lines and verses, but others, the visual aspect is just somehow is a great teacher. So that's important. Then we're doing a sermon series on freedom. Last week was on freedom from sin and death. This week is freedom to serve the neighbor. So if you look at the Sunday forum when it comes, when it comes out, part of it is freedom. If we say freedom to, we should always be asking the question, then freedom from what to what? What have I been freed from? Because just loving and serving the neighbor is not always the easiest thing to do. Right? So what did I have to be freed from so that, I can be open to helping serve the neighbor? I'm also reading one of my favorite poems from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's Stations on the Road to Freedom. Four stations. We write just a little blurb on each one, saying to get on the pathway of freedom, first, it's about self-control. Secondly, it's about action. He says we find freedom in actually doing, not just spinning the wheels. Third, it's in suffering. Fourth, it's in death. And this is someone who wrote the poem right before he was martyred. So someone who's kind of gone through all these, so to speak, paths of freedom. So just something to look forward to, and we'll discuss that then on Sunday, the poem in particular. Other things, remember the pig roast on July 28th, 11 o'clock, one service. All our communities will come together, even the park will encourage you to come in. And because you can't eat a pig all by yourself.
Don't be a pig.
Make a pig of yourself.
Also, I'm a bit hesitant to say this because there's still some caveats. But when it's good news, you want to bring forth. And we had a big moment for Emmanuel Academies this week at Southern Seminary. As you know, we're trying to pull off almost the impossible. How can a congregation start a seminary? How can we run a seminary from the basis of a congregation? Never been done in the United States as far as Lutherans are concerned. So part of it was, can we get students and deliver education? Part of it was, can we get accreditation from all the agencies, right? Can we get the right mix of administration and faculty? So we've accomplished all that. But now the final step on the road to freedom is, will the ELCA allow us to find a place in the system? And what the ELCA has done, it's a little antiquated, but I get it, is only they can sign the documents. One of the seminaries is the only one given permission to sign the document that a student is capable of doing ministry in a Lutheran church. So about half of the students in the United States do not go to ELCA seminaries. They go to Duke, they go to Candler, they go to Harvard, they go to other places. But if you do that, finally, you have to come back and the seminary has to sign the paper that you are kosher, Lutheran kosher. And then they say, well, then, in this case, Southern Seminary, what is it you need to sign that document? And they say, well, we need 6 classes. That way, enough of our professors have gotten to know, in this case, Emmanuel Academy students to sign with integrity that you're ready to do ministry. Well, here we've saved all this money, and if we have our students take 6 courses, now we've given back all the money we saved because they're that much more expensive, about 90%, almost double. 600 times the price. So it kind of defeats our mission if we have to pay for the courses. And so there's been orneriness, there's been all sorts of things, but we spent 2 days up in Columbia, South Carolina, Southern Seminary. The bishop played a huge and a positive role. Basically told Southern Seminary, I don't want to leave here unless there is a signed agreement.
Our Florida Bahamas bishop. Yay.
Yeah, very positive. He said, Emmanuel Academy is producing seminarians for my synod. We've got to stop this logjam because it's hurting, students who I know now, and it isn't working. So we need this thing to work. So we signed an agreement. This is a big deal. It's never happened in the United States. And the compromise was basically our students will take the 6 courses, but you will pay.
Yay.
So just treat our students like you treat any other ELCA student.
But I
Pay for the
understand,
tuition.
Pastor, have they already taken these courses and then now they're being?
They would have to, or go back. So now the only person gets caught sort of in between is BB. Because she's ready to, she's way down the road in internship. So she's a special case, and we solved that one too. So they finally have accepted, now that she's halfway through her internship, they've accepted us as a site for internship. It's a mess, I don't want to go into all that, but everyone, it was goodwill, it was problem solving, it was, now we have a pathway through the ELCA system.
But it should be, because when we have such a shortage of pastors, not even just our pastors, across the board, I would hope that people would be more understanding and bending and flexible to, I mean, that's a big commitment from these students.
That was basically the bishop's opening comment.
I mean,
He said, and now people, young pastors are not coming to Florida. So old pastors are coming to Florida. It's not necessarily the pastor you want.
they might retire the next year, maybe. I mean, you don't know.
But they're going to retire soon. So they came here to retire. Time is up. But not always. But it's not a good pool of young, it's not the Will Kittengers who are now, and of course, Will didn't come. He's a
Yeah.
Floridian.
And what an
He stayed.
infusion he put into our congregation.
Bishop
What an
sees all
infusion.
that. So why not have a system that raises up students and keeps them here? That's what he's
Yeah.
trying to do.
Yeah.
We raise up Floridian students and you keep them here. You make it
Right.
compelling. Well, you don't do that if there's this onerous system that is punishing Emmanuel Academy graduates. Plus, we attract more Latinos, as Frida knows, and they haven't been able to do that. And obviously, that is a priority for the bishop. So, through a whole variety of things, we've talked about this before. His coming down here for the installation of David Hilliard was a big deal because he saw all the people from your community. He saw Venezuelans, you know, and to be specific, but not just Venezuelans, right? But I think he'd seen that in reports, but he'd never, when you experience it personally, it's a different thing. It's a different thing.
Not that he hadn't had an opportunity.
Yes.
Not to make it.
Not
too
to say.
far. But we haven't had real good official visits in the past. You know, Bishop Eaton came, I thought that was a disaster.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when the ELC Churchwide came, that was really a disaster. So we've tried several times. This is the first time when we went to Chicago. That was a disaster.
Why, you said, why, what was made it a disaster?
How to summarize? We were seen as a threat, as right up there next to evil, threatening the system.
Pretty powerful.
And that's the way they would have told the story. We were colonialists. Who gave you the right to go to Rwanda? Frank Lutheran pastors. Did we give you the right? Didn't know we had to go through the ELCA. It's not our State Department. I mean, like, but there was that feeling. What are you guys always doing stuff? You know, who gave? And a lot of people don't know the old stories. When Steve was here, he invited all these seminaries. And Steve made a big point in Chicago to say, we're not doing any ends arounds. We're going right at the system. We're telling you this is what we want to do. We want help systems and accompaniment. But that was never sort of acknowledged. So there was just tension, I would say, for all sorts of reasons, maybe even some personal reasons. There was one president in particular, one of our largest seminaries, who was opposing us behind the scenes, again, a threat, because their numbers are all going down. And then all of a sudden, what are you guys doing in Florida? Taking our students. That's the way it would be framed. It's not true, but it's the way it was framed. So this was a big deal. And we had an MOU with the seminary years ago, which was very positive. But then they canceled it. So interestingly, that MOU, we were not allowed to sign. It was between Luther Seminary and the Synod. We were not even given the dignity to sit at the table and sign the document. So that we were a signatory to the agreement yesterday was also probably a bigger deal than even Southern realized.
Well, and we had had a previous sort of ordered arrangement with Southern Seminary out of the Chicago meeting.
They were empowered in Chicago by all the seminaries to work out an agreement with us. So we all flew up there, thought it was going to be an agreement, and then the president said no. And he said no by not showing up to the meeting.
Whoa.
And this is church,
Yes.
and this is about God.
Yeah, supposedly, right.
When David was president of Trinity Seminary, that's when the ELCA and the LCA combined seminary. I mean, my David did everything but stand on his head to bring peace. And I mean, one group sat on this side and one group on that side, and he would try his darndest to combine them, and not gonna sit on that side, you know. Oh,
There's loyalty in our system. This is mostly clergy, but there's loyalty to the seminary like almost nothing else. It just is. And so where you went to school, a little bit like going to college, you know, some of you actually have loyalties to certain universities. I've heard through the grapevine. And those go deep. And so with clergy, they're, you know, it's a big formative moment in your life, and it goes deep. So people fight for the seminaries. Now, Southern Seminary is quite unique, and I'll wrap it up here, but Southern Lutheranism is the thing. It's unique among all the other schools. It even goes back to Germany. There's the Salzburg movement. These Germans were from Salzburg were persecuted, killed. And some of them fled that area and went to Prussia, I think Eastern Prussia. And some came here to the south and started a certain brand of Lutheranism that they brought from Germany. And it's unique. It's not like any of the other Lutheran groups. And it has something to do with Southern Lutheranism. And that was maintained, sort of that tradition was held and furthered at Southern Seminary. Now, why is that important? Now, we're a mutt here
Yeah,
in Florida. So there is no sort of pure Southern Lutheranism or Upper Midwestern Lutheranism or ALC or all these traditions. We're the mutt that everybody came to Florida and everybody knows to them or not, or have furthered all these traditions. Which is why Emmanuel Academies does well here. We work well with mutts. Where the other seminaries are comfortable, like Southern in North and South Carolina, 'cause it's sort of that's their thing. That's their water that they're used to swimming in. Lutheran Seminary, where I was, Upper Midwest, we know that area, we know that territory. All the pastors were formed basically in our seminaries. LSTC, same way, kind of this German Midwestern LCA presence in the Midwest. So each seminary has sort of adapted or formed the culture, but Florida is different. So what are we? What is Emmanuel? Or do you want to know?
Yes.
We were LCA, which is a former East Coast, right? Transplant in Florida, except Steve is not LCA.
Yeah.
So when he comes, he's got that Norwegian piety of
Yes,
the
yeah.
Upper Midwestern Lutheranism, as does Frank.
right.
Mhm.
So then all of a sudden you've got mixtures here, little tastes of LCA and little tastes of ALC. And that has to do with polity, how you make decisions, how you do liturgy, all that stuff that we often don't think about. Was all brought here. An ALC church doesn't normally have a procession at the beginning of the service with the cross coming down. That's LCA. ALC would find that, oh, terrible.
Also, the governance is different.
Governance is very different. ALC was much more congregational
Definitely.
in scope. LCA was much more. Yeah. LCA wanted bishops immediately. ALC rejected bishops immediately. And that's where they were fighting all those mergers. But what's going to happen? What do we name? Do we call them presidents? Do we call them bishops? So in any case, having said all that, was a big deal. He just has to confirm the dean that they can provide the scholarships that he promised, and it's a done deal. So it's a big deal. I'd say historic.
Good.
All right, I'd get that off my chest.
So that should be something we're really praying for.
Right, and as congregants, we should know this, and other people should know this too. You know, not just our little cloistered group here, you know.
Actually, it's even bigger than congregants. What I discovered traveling is pastors are thrilled to hear about America. All of them.
Oh,
Thrilled because it represents innovation in theological education. Everybody's been screaming about that for 20 years.
Yeah.
But the powers that be are not thrilled.
right.
And so you've got this, and how do you communicate that? Now we have to wait. That's the caveat. He has to fulfill financially what they promised. But we'll know that in a month. And then we can be more forthcoming and celebrate in larger gatherings than just a small one. So
When the students graduate, are they bound to have employment with our churches, or are they allowed to go to other places? That's a question that I think that's really an important
no,
question.
they're put on a national, wherever they want to go in the network. But remember, we have multiple networks. We have the ELCA, but you can become a Presbyterian pastor here as well, or Episcopal priest, or UCC pastor. So we have these relationships with other churches that just in case they wanted to call you, we have what's called altar and pulpit function.
Good.
So that opens you up to a huge.
Yeah, bigger.
if you
That's
wanna call
freedom,
it
that's
a market.
actually a positive thing. I mean,
Huge, it's huge. Yeah. All right, let's go from pleasant news to bad news. 2 Timothy. When I read 2 Timothy, I get sad. It's a sad letter. Why is it a sad?
Although he's at the end of his journal.
He's always been positive from prison,
Yes,
right? This
I'm
is
gonna get
from
out.
prison until now. Now he realizes this isn't gonna go well. He can see the writing on the wall. He always thought his citizenship as a Roman would get him out, because he thought, I'm innocent. Up to that point, up to a certain point, we'll talk about that point. Romans protected him as a Jew, and Christians were seen as a Jewish side group. But that all changed with one emperor,
Nero.
Nero.
Yeah.
And old.
He was.
And when you hear Nero, think Hitler
Yeah, right.
for Christians. I mean, you know, when we say, oh, who's an evil leader? No, there have been others than Hitler, but we always think Hitler. But there, you could have, there were those in Czechoslovakia who came to be associated. I remember Idi Amin in
Yes, yes.
Uganda, always considered evil in that area. But Nero is considered evil, Christians, because does anyone know the story of Nero and why he started the persecution of Christians?
Not fine, no.
Well, he had decided to do a major works project in Rome. Right? He wanted to do some major building to his glory. Unfortunately, all that land was taken. People were living on that land. There were slums, there were, good housing, bad housing. So, as he noodled about it, how might I free up that space for some new building projects?
Fire.
We'll start a fire. And he burned down a quarter of Rome. Quarter, big town. Well, people were irate. And who were they blaming?
The Jews.
Well, first they blamed Nero. I mean, people aren't stupid, they know how these things work. And so Nero had to find a scapegoat for this clearinghouse of property. And so he blamed the Christians. So from becoming somewhat protected, now Christians were wrong. And there had been all sorts of rumors about weird Christian practices. As you remember, Christians would meet to be safe in some weird places like cemeteries, because Christians weren't
Caves.
nervous about that at all. But Romans were, because of the evil forces. But Christians would find respite there, and then they would, as Romans said, they were eating blood, they were practicing cannibalism, right? Because they heard the communion practices, this is my body, this is my blood, and that kind of spread like wildfire. The Christians are
Cannibalistic.
yeah, I mean, about evil, right? So he could pick on Christians, and they could even cite Pontius Pilate back in the day, right? Or Herod later on, who crucified Jesus. So there are all sorts of stories that can be told, and they were. And Paul gets caught up in that. So from having confidence in prison to now realizing this is it. He was beheaded shortly after this book in Rome. So who does he choose to give him comfort? So obviously, I think we can close it. We kept that open for you. If we can bring our chair over for.
Sorry, I'm late, but.
It is what it is.
Well, I have it in my hand, so far so good.
We can tell that this young Timothy, remember, he, young, faithful grandmother, faithful mother, seems to just be a solid young, now missionary. Paul calls him to the missionary work to give comfort to Ephesus, and now Paul wants comfort. and this is the first time, right? He was thankful for the comfort before to be visited in prison. But now he's actually desiring, so you know he's hurting. He's hurting. And so it's like, please come. I need, the moral support this time. So it's quite remarkable, I think. He's going to call him to be faithful. He knows these are some of his last words. He knows this is not going to end well. By the way, where do we get, the numerology around evil?
13.
666.
Oh,
Do you know where that comes from? Nero's name.
Oh,
sorry?
Nero's name. Nero. If you do the numerical mumbo jumbo around Nero Caesar, it comes out 666. So this became the way Christians could talk about what was happening, the persecution of Nero, in secret.
Code. In a code.
Yeah. All right, so what we got? Nero's persecution, 64 is the Great Fire. Nero is evil, 666. We have Timothy, close, but he's going to call him be faithful. And shortly afterwards, Paul is beheaded. Now, always remember, many scholars don't think he wrote this book because the vocabulary is different. And we all have this, we all know this, that we all talk a certain way, we have a certain vocabulary that we use. Paul puts it into letters. And so if we would to do an AI evaluation of his letters, words would stick out. You say, wait a minute, that's not the way Paul talks. He just doesn't use that kind of language. And so some would say maybe Timothy wrote this in his stead. So what we're talking about, though, is there isn't plagiarism in these at this time, but a student would honor their professor or their teacher by doing something in their name because their intent was to replicate their thought. So just like I might go up and quote someone in the pulpit to make sure I didn't invent that phrase, I'm borrowing it from someone. You could do that with a whole letter here. And that was just done. Or I might give a lecture and I wouldn't sign it myself, I'd sign my mentor's name to reflect. That's what I was trying to do, was reflect their thought that I had learned from years and years of being their student. So whether it's Paul who wrote it or his student or Timothy, those things don't bother me. We all say they're inspired, it doesn't matter. We let scholars do their work, but it's still inspired, right? That doesn't change.
I have a question. Is there any historical background as to Eunice and Lois? I've always wondered how the grandmother became a Christian and the mother, when the father was Greek. And I didn't know.
They were baptized as children. If that's what
no, I just wondered if there was any writings and, Josephus or somebody had,
So the quick answer is I don't know.
yeah, that's right.
I'm sure there is something. I'm sure scholars have asked the same questions that you have, and they've scoured, like ancient texts, right? Even with Nero, for example, to justify his persecutions, of course, every scholar says, well, is this real? Was this mythology? Was it just one Roman emperor trashing another Roman emperor? And so they always go back and look for historical examples. Now they have in Rome found evidence of fire, not who started the fire, but they've, when you dig, if you have a big fire that wipes out a quarter of the town, you should be able to discover remnants of that in archaeological digs, and they have. So that, and then we have some scholars who wrote about Nero's persecution and his disparagement of Christians. So I'm guessing, Edie, yes, I'm sure people have asked that question, have some result. I just don't know. I'll give you something to report on next week.
Research it.
Yeah. I wouldn't know where to begin.
Google.
Yeah, right. And they don't have any specific answers from what I've.
She just
Yeah.
We don't know much about,
Yeah.
don't worry.
Yeah.
I don't know either.
Now, one of Paul's, some of the things that he's gonna write to Timothy, he wrote already in the first book of Timothy. And so we've got some teachers who are creating problems again in the church. And so it's gotten worse, hasn't gotten better. And so one of the reasons he wants Timothy to go is to attack that problem. And we don't, let's see if this, I'm trying to remember if he flags all the issues differently than in First Timothy, or whether it's just, my feeling was it was just a repeat of what they'd experienced. But mark this as chapter 3. There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited. This is all just one paragraph. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power.
Look like today.
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, good that we were past that.
Oh, no,
No.
still there.
Have nothing to do with them. Now, that is quite a list.
Yes.
Think about, look at the list again.
Yeah.
Good gracious.
And it says have nothing to do with them, but on the other hand, how do we evangelize if we don't have anything to do with these people?
I think it's the teachers.
Oh, the
that he's
two
referring to, not,
okay. Possible.
but although it does say here, people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, so forth. This would be, I thought he could have, if I'd have been coaching him, I said, well, you can edit that list, right? And my guess is Paul would have pushed back and say, no, I meant every word.
This is it.
I really thought about this one.
Yeah.
They are the kind, these, who worm their way into homes and gain control over weak-willed women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to acknowledge the truth. Just as Janus and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these men oppose the truth. Men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. But they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure the
Yeah.
folly is clear to everyone. Unfortunately.
So this is hard. I mean, to think about how that would play out in a local congregation. Paul's going after these guys with the hardest possible. Can you imagine that type of conversation, let's say here at an annual meeting or something, or someone wrote a letter and say, using this type of language? And at the same time, they're receiving persecution and death from outside from the Romans. That's a lot of pressure on the congregation. And you can imagine people standing up and saying, can't we just focus on the main thing here? And
The gospel.
and others saying, no, that's what we're trying to do. And then Timothy going, but let me read you this letter from Paul. Okay, that added another whole element of tension in the room. So this is not a pleasant time. That's why I say it's a sad letter, because of the persecution from outside and from just the confusion and the chaos internally. Because you didn't have an official system of who's a leader, who's not a leader. I'm sure people would just show up, and if they had the gifts and they had the charisma, and they would be your leader. They didn't have to go to Southern Seminary and get their Form D. And even then, that can be really difficult. But there's no structure. Let's say here, if we'd have an issue, you could always go to the bishop and say, we got an issue with our leaders. We got confusion, right? So we got a system, that's why systems were put in place, because of this confusion that can happen. None of that exists. So all of a sudden, leaders emerge. What do you do with the leaders? They're good teachers, right? They're charismatic teachers. They seem to know their stuff. And Paul's going, no, they don't know their stuff. This is all, can't you see? It's all slanderous and a few other words that he throws in there. So I again, I feel this sadness every time I read 2 Timothy. Because of all the pressures and well, you can imagine people just going home and going, oh, I go to church, you know, to get a blessing, and this is hard. This is just hard stuff.
But you know, you have this today with these churches that sprout up, and it's kind of the same way. It's just somebody is charismatic, somebody's a good speaker, and they make stuff up along the way, and it makes people feel good, so they follow.
And send money.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the-
Yeah.
yes. Mhm.
It's an interesting point. We in the United States, the way we've solved some of these tensions is we just let churches spring up like mushrooms in the neighborhood. So if you're not happy with Emmanuel, you just go throw a rock and go down the street to wherever that rock lands, right? And then you go there for 5 years, you go, I think I want to go back to. So there's that freedom to go back and forth. And usually that doesn't cause too great a tension unless people are leaving your church in blocks and in waves.
Yeah.
And that's happened here a couple times, but not usually because of teaching. Usually there's other things that have happened. It's not as tension filled as this, where there aren't other churches. This is it. You know, it's probably a home church, so there's even an intimacy there that it's hard for us to replicate these days. So this even hurts more in some sense because you're meeting in someone's home and you know everybody. And it's not like I can just take off down the road for a couple of years. And then, so it's tough. Now you'll experience that in certain places in the world where there'll be one Christian church. That's about it. I mean, there aren't that many options. Roman Catholics have experienced that in Latin America, where, you know, when the Pentecostals came in, they're taking everybody from the Roman Catholic Church. And so that creates real tension between Pentecostals and Roman Catholics in Latin America, because it's not like first time evangelism. It's often taking people from a church. You know, we used to call that cheap stealing. And that becomes a pretty serious matter. Now, we've got some of that with Lutherans when megachurches started developing in the 70s. Many Lutherans, would say, well, let's try that megachurch down the road. And they like the glitz and the glamour and the professionalism. And, you know, it was new and exotic. It wasn't that little Lutheran church that I was used to.
Yeah.
This is exciting. But look at how many people are here. 1,500 people. And back home, there was only 60 of us, you know, worshiping. So I think that those waves of moving out are over. And sometimes you actually see them move back now, which is interesting.
My nephew and godson goes to a mega church in Louisville. And I mean, they have 17,000 different campuses every Sunday. He said, now, Andy, you stay here and keep your cell phone, because he had to take the bus to go get his car in the parking lot. And he was calling me as to, you know, when it was time to come out of church, etc. But one of the things that I thought, and the sermon was right on, I appreciated that. And I got upset with Jaden, but I couldn't, you know, chastise him, because all of a sudden, here comes little wafers passed down. Then we had little buses of grape juice passed down. Absolutely no words of institution. And Jaden, who was like 6, said, "Oh, snack time." Oh, and I thought, you know,
After growing up in vacation Bible school, he did
right,
exactly
you know, I thought, and I mean, I couldn't really, chastise him, because I thought, I have never been to a church. I absolutely know it's an institution, and for somebody who just came in off the street, they would think it was snack
This is-
time,
yeah.
you know?
Did everybody take it together or just
Oh,
your
no,
own
you
deal?
took it as, you know,
Oh,
you passed
yeah,
the
yeah,
plate,
yeah.
took one, you know.
Okay, okay.
No, I mean, there wasn't,
He was right.
yeah.
Right.
What's that? Yeah.
So before we watch this now, for those who are watching, we're gonna turn and ask Melissa to read 2 Timothy 4 to begin with verse 9. And again, this is such a personal book. I want to set that tone here, that we hear some pain from Paul, that he's willing to be a little bit vulnerable in this. Verse 9.
Okay, do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Christians has gone to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I send Tychicus to Ephesus. Ephesus, what am I doing? I know it. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scroll, especially the parchment.
Now, why is he saying bring my coat? It's gonna get cold soon in Rome.
And he's in that damn cold.
And it could be that when he was picked up and locked up in Troas, he wasn't able to pack his things. So he's saying, go back to my home where I was, pack my things, but especially
My
the
coat.
coat. You're gonna die here in prison. Keep going.
Alexander, the metal worker, did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him, because he is strongly opposed to our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen.
Okay, so do you get the feel there?
Yeah, he knows it's coming.
And he's been abandoned.
He has been, and
Now, one person, he calls down retribution,
yeah.
but everyone else, he says, I kind of forget, right? But whoever the metal worker is here,
Great deal of.
Alexander, there's some real pain there. Everyone has abandoned me. You know, it's tough when you're running from prison, and you know, the sword's coming.
It's a quick death. I mean, it's not like crucifixion or anything. Yeah, I would imagine.
There's probably a reason for it, because he was Roman, so it might have been.
Kind
The
of.
torture aspect was not, it's needed, but of course, we had the torture by Nero in,
Oh, he crucified
stadiums,
people all
yeah.
along the roadway.
and I mean, fighting lions is
Yeah.
torture. You know, that's not.
How did Paul become a Roman citizen? I've always, you know, he always proclaims it, and I thought, how did that happen?
Another part of your homework. Keep it going.
Yeah.
That's been your question.
Be careful what you ask.
When he went to the university, obviously, he was trained in Greek thought, and so that's what makes Paul such a wonderful contrast with the disciples.
Oh, yeah.
Disciples uneducated,
Uneducated.
powerful, passionate, committed, loyal, but not educated. Paul,
Educated.
all that plus massively educated, so he can freely work in Greek culture with the best of them. But then remember, he also says, wait a minute, I'm a Pharisee in the Pharisees. I've been trained in the law, I know my stuff, right? So he's like an elite in both worlds.
Right.
And so a unique, and he's writing back and forth to the philosophers in Rome, Seneca and others. I mean, so that would be comparable today to a pastor writing some of the elite philosophers at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or other places. In other words, he is both very comfortable writing a letter in a jail, but he can also give and take at the highest levels as well.
And his knowledge of rhetoric. I mean, one thing
Mhm.
he does so beautifully is analyze his audience. And he speaks to them, you know, in Rome, he's speaking to the unknown God, you know, and I mean, he right on. So he.
Because that was part of the classical training.
And classical
It was
training,
a training in rhetoric. All right, so
yeah.
now let's watch.
Paul's second letter to Timothy. This is Paul's final and most personal letter. He wrote it from yet another time in prison, and it's addressed to Paul's dear co-worker and protege, the young Timothy. Now, we don't know how much time exactly has passed since he wrote 1 Timothy, but we can see that Paul's situation has changed, and for the worse. He's imprisoned in Rome, which could refer to his time under house arrest that was mentioned in Acts chapter 28, or it could be that he was released from that imprisonment, had another long season of ministry, and then was arrested again in Troas. Either way, Paul says he's in the middle of his court trial now, and it is not going well. He's pretty sure he's not going to survive this one. And so out of this very dark situation, Paul appeals to Timothy, who it seems is still on assignment in Ephesus. He asks Timothy to come be with him in prison so Paul can pass on to him the church planting mission he started. The letter's design is pretty simple. There are two large sections where Paul challenges Timothy. First, to accept his calling as a leader, and then, before he comes to Paul, to deal with the corrupt teachers that are still causing problems in Ephesus. After this, Paul concludes the letter. So Paul begins by thanking God for Timothy and his family, specifically for his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. They immersed the young Timothy in the story of the Old Testament scriptures. They instilled in him a deep faith in the Messiah, Jesus. And so because of that firm faith, Paul offers his first challenge to Timothy. He calls him to reject any temptation to be ashamed of the good news about Jesus, or of Paul who's suffering in prison for announcing that good news. Now, the reason Paul needs to emphasize this is the negative stigma that he gained by his frequent times in prison. It made many of Paul's co-workers, in fact, doubt his calling as an apostle. He mentions two guys, Phygellus and Hermogenes. They deserted Paul because they were ashamed of being associated with Paul, who was an accused criminal now. So Paul asked Timothy to reject any fear of shame and to come see him. Now, Paul knows that this is a costly request. It could put Timothy at risk. And so he reminds Timothy that Jesus' grace is a source of power, which is really important. You're going to need it because following Jesus is not easy. It requires everything that you have. Paul likens following Jesus to enrolling as a soldier who's striving to please their commanding officer. Or it's like an athlete who's training their body for a competition. Or it's like a hardworking, dedicated farmer. All three of these metaphors involve a person who's committed to something bigger than themselves and who's willing to sacrifice and endure challenges to accomplish a greater goal. And of course, the highest example of this is Jesus himself. Because of his commitment to the Father, he suffered crucifixion by the Romans. And similarly, Paul himself is now suffering in a Roman prison. Hardship and sacrifice are inherent to the Christian life. And this is why Jesus' resurrection is the foundation of Christian hope. Or as Paul puts it in a short and very powerful poem, if we died with him, then we will live with him. If we endure, then we will reign with him. If we deny him, then he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he will remain faithful, for he's unable to deny his own nature. God's love for our world has opened up a new hope through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so for those who will take the risk of trusting and following Jesus, God promises vindication and life. For those who reject him, God will honor that decision and do the same. But people's faithlessness will never compel God to abandon his faithfulness. And so Paul calls Timothy to faithfulness, knowing that it may come with a cost. Paul moves into the second half of the letter, calling Timothy to confront the corrupt teachers in Ephesus before he comes to Rome. Their teaching is spreading in the Ephesian church like a cancer. They've targeted and corrupted a number of influential women in the church. These are likely the wealthy women that Paul had to deal with in his first letter to Timothy. He doesn't offer much detail about the teacher's bad theology. Timothy already knows about it, but he does give us one hint. He says they teach that the resurrection has already taken place. Now, we don't know if the teachers are following a Greek philosophical rejection of the whole idea of bodily resurrection, and they think it's only really about spiritual experience. Or it could be that they've simply distorted Paul's teaching about the resurrection life that begins now through the power of the Spirit. Either way, the problem is that they've abandoned the robust future hope of resurrection and of new creation, and they've embraced instead a private, hyper-spiritualized Christianity that is disconnected from day-to-day life. And so Paul calls Timothy to raise up faithful leaders who are going to teach the real good news about Jesus. They should avoid senseless arguments that result from debating the teachers. In contrast, Timothy and his leadership team are to keep the main thing the main thing. They should focus on the core storyline and message of the scriptures, which in Paul's day meant primarily the Old Testament. These scriptures, Paul says, are able to give you wisdom that leads to salvation through faith in the Messiah, Jesus. He's saying the whole point of the scriptures is to tell you a unified story that leads to Jesus and that has wisdom to offer the whole world. Then Paul talks about Scripture's nature and purpose. He says all Scripture is divinely breathed, literally God-spirited. It's a reference to the Spirit's role in guiding the biblical authors so that what they wrote is what God wanted his people to hear. And God speaks to his people in the Scriptures for a very practical purpose. He says they're useful for teaching, telling me things I didn't know before. They're useful for challenging, getting in my face about the things I say I believe but I don't actually live consistently with. They're useful for correcting me, exposing my messed up ways of thinking and behaving. And they're useful for training me in righteousness, showing me a new way to be truly human. And this is all so that God's people will be prepared for doing good. Paul closes the letter by reminding Timothy that he's probably not going to make it out of prison alive. So he asks Timothy to come as soon as possible, before winter. He doesn't want to freeze in his cell, and so he's going to need his heavy coat that he had to leave behind. And also, could Timothy please bring those personal documents that he left in Troas, likely when he got arrested. He also mentions Alexander, who's an especially dangerous man that Timothy should avoid. He's probably responsible for Paul's most recent arrest. Paul concludes by mentioning how nearly everyone's abandoned him in prison, and his only source of comfort now is the personal presence of Jesus, who stands with him and will deliver him even if he dies. And so the letter ends. The letter of 2 Timothy stands as a reminder that Paul's very influential life and mission were marked by persistent challenge and suffering and struggle. Following Jesus involves risk and sacrifice. It means inviting tension and discomfort into your life. And these things are not a sign of Jesus' absence. Rather, as Paul discovered with generations of Christians after him, that precisely in those dark and difficult moments, Jesus' love and faithfulness can become the most tangible and real. And that's what 2 Timothy, Paul's final letter, is all about.
All right. What sticks out to you from the film?
When he said, when Paul said something about if you deny Jesus, he will deny you. And my first thought immediately was when they brought Jesus before he was crucified and they asked Peter. And he predicted to Peter that you will deny me 3 times before that conference. And of course, Peter said no. And yet, he did deny him, and Jesus did not forsake him. He still loved him. Mm-hmm. And that's the part that I hold to, because that other part sounds like, you know what, you're out. But I like the other version better, when I think that Jesus was loving enough, and even when he came to the disciples, when they all were fearful and thought that he left them, and he said, peace, my peace I give to you, I leave with you. That's what I want to hold to myself. I don't want to think that God's going to deny me if I mess up, because I do mess up. So,
But take a look. Do you have that text in front of you?
which one?
The one you're referring to.
I don't, no, I don't have it right in front of me.
You want to take a look at it, because now there's some tension in the text.
Mhm.
And I felt something similar here, but it said, if you deny me, I will deny you. But if you are unfaithful, Jesus will still be faithful because he can't go against his nature.
Okay, but it was the denial part that,
The denial part's the hard one, and they're
Yes.
referring very specifically to sitting in front of a trial court like Paul is. And you're asked very point blank, are you a Christian?
What do you say?
So it's not about sins in life or making mistakes, or that's not, the reference here is formal in front of a trial lawyer. Will you deny Jesus? Because if you deny Jesus, it says he will deny
but
you.
Peter did that when the centurions and all these people were questioning. He three times, he said, no, I don't know that man. He adamantly stuck to that story. I mean, so I don't know, when Jesus forgave.
Now, it wasn't a trial.
It wasn't a trial, but he was getting ready. Jesus was brought before, he was, yes. So I mean, to me, that's pretty close. You're in that
Right.
atmosphere, is what I'm saying.
I think there's tensions but here in his text, the tensions between denial and unfaithfulness, and just in the text, and he's not cross-referencing the life of Peter here.
Okay.
Peter was not standing in front of the judge.
Not be unfaithful. I deny, and then what's the difference being unfaithful?
What do you think?
Well, I'm
Yeah,
just saying, if you're unfaithful, you're going to deny. So if you deny, isn't that?
There's
Are you saying the words are exactly the same?
Yeah, in my mind, well.
And let's face it, we often use them in a very similar way, right? I think this is more formal than just, I screwed up. I deny Jesus through my actions, through my lifestyle, through my misdeeds, through my breaking of the commandments. And obviously we'd say, well, if you do that in your life consistently, aren't you denying Jesus? I think we would say, yeah. So kind of a common sense approach.
Yeah.
Here, I think that's more referring to, if you're hauled before a magistrate, don't deny Jesus, because they'll deny you. It's not about sin or lifestyle or behavior. That's what I think in this text, because they're facing this persecution from Nero, where, like Paul, you're dragged before magistrates and you're asked point blank certain things.
Is it kind of like Luther, here I stand?
Yes.
No.
He stayed.
Yeah.
with us, yeah.
We're in a formal set,
Yeah.
in front of the emperor.
How many of us have had to really say, yes, I am a Christian? When we were in Russia, it took me back. I was in the classroom and the students were asking me questions. And they knew that I was a professor at a small Lutheran college. And so the one girl just point blank said, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes, I am." End of discussion. It was one of the first times I think that I have ever been point blank asked.
Yeah.
I have not.
And in a situation that could have been pretty intimidating.
Right, I mean, because this, they're not.
What year was this eating?
In the 90s, I think it was like 92, maybe.
Okay.
I've always been so poor at writing down dates. No,
But it was after Blasphemous. It was after, Russia changed.
it was just at that beginning, I mean, yeah.
So, first of all, I think we can back off here and say, one of the reasons this is a hard passage to understand is most of us don't face that sort of formal, legal challenge to our faith. So that's one of the beauties of our country. And every once in a while you have to say, well, even though take it for granted, boy, that's a great thing, that I'm not hauled before magistrates and asked about my faith, and that's a fraught issue. We also remember Christians who might have said, no, I'm not, and gained their freedom and felt awful about it. And then would have had to justify and say, well, I just did what I had to do because I have to take care of my kids. If I would have said that, then I would have been taken out, and I have responsibilities. You can imagine in the early church, all those conversations in the local church where someone is hauled off and killed, the other person got off because they lied, and then now they're all gathered for worship on Sunday morning, you know? And I think that's part of Paul's background. You got to stand up for the faith when it's a legal matter. But it's interesting on that one, he says, and if you are unfaithful, but God will be faithful. It's just a beautiful gospel message there. It's not what you were expecting. You know, I was expecting the hard line here. And if you're unfaithful, God's going to be.
Define unfaithful.
He doesn't, I don't know what he's, I have to look again at what they're dealing with here.
I have notes on those two words here from my Bible. It says, if we disown him, he will also disown us. Speaks of a final permanent denial, such as that of an apostate, not the temporary failure of a true believer like Peter. There's a difference.
Well, he was human.
So-
Yeah, it's great.
What was the denial? What was it? Apostasy,
Apostate, yeah,
which means you deny the faith.
yeah, right. Say, I'm no longer a believer.
All right. Anything else stick out in the?
One thing that sticks out is I don't think they addressed it. And it was in my dad's Bible. He had it underlined and he also had it written on a little card. And it was in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me. And not only to me, but also to all
To his appearing.
his appearing. And in his Bible, he had reservation guaranteed.
Oh, bless his
Oh,
heart.
wow.
Oh,
That's the meaningful part for me.
Wow, it's
oh,
powerful.
Jan, what a
That's
legacy.
powerful.
That's so nice.
He's kept the
A little
faith.
bit like Timothy.
Yeah, thank you
Yes.
for sharing. That was great.
I can never share it without it.
But those are happy tears. Those are tears of joy because what a promise. What a promise.
You know, and that. This used to be written on a lot of gravestones.
Oh, really?
We don't have gravestones anymore, so you don't, I don't see this, but if you go through an old graveyard, sometimes you'll see this written. Mhm. I fought the fight, fought the good fight. Some of us might even imagine being able to say that to our kids or grandkids, at some point at the end of our lives, I mean, framed largely, how do you give witness to your faith to those who mean the most to you? And here Paul's doing it to Timothy, who obviously, his legacy, so to speak, in ministry.
But you know, in many ways, Dietrich Bonhoeffer did that in our lifetime.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Bonhoeffer.
What matters
Yeah,
is
yeah. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's why the roads to freedom that we're going to discuss Sunday, the paths to freedom. He ends with death, but not as a negative, but as a positive
Yeah,
for him. The ultimate
it's an
freedom.
earthly death.
The ultimate freedom. And Bonhoeffer, by the way, replicates Paul in so many different ways. He was also abandoned by the church. Near the end, they would not even pray for him. They took him off the prayer list because they said he was not fighting the fight of faith, but fighting the fight of politics, and we don't pray for those.
Oh.
So for many years he was not considered a martyr in Germany. It's still kind of a debate. Some say yes, some say no. And So many abandoned him. And of course, then he spent the last, year and a half going from prison to prison, as they were doing their research from the courts on what his role was, but he knew they would find out what his role had been. And so it was only a matter of time. Now, of course, he gives great comfort to those in prison. He's known, like Paul and like Martin Luther King Jr., for his prison letters, some of the most insightful letters, because obviously the mind is very focused in prison. And what's unfortunate is he was killed 2 weeks before the Allied troops freed up his prison camp as a point of Nazi leaders wanted to leave no gifts behind. It was spite, just pure spite. We're not going to leave any of the intelligentsia, none of the leadership. So doctors, theologians, professors were all killed. So as to leave scorched earth policy, so to speak, cultural. And when you think, yeah. So one thing before we go, here is from Tacitus, who wrote in his annals. He wrote the history of much of the Roman Empire. He writes this about Nero, and he's talking about the rumors that Nero had lit the fires. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class of hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procreators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, referring to Christians, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. There you go. We love you too. All right, we'll break up in our groups now. Again, trying to focus on sad letter, but how he's writing from prison here to his colleague and loyal colleague, you have to say, Timothy. All right.